In this next section, we're going to start off with brokerage defined. And I got to be honest with you, as I go through some of this, I know that some of this material will be covered in other chapters, but to stay consistent with the syllabus, I wanted to go over it. So here's what I want you to do. If you're watching this slide, listen, 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 and then I will let you know when I talk about something I think is going to be high level important information. Let's start off by talking about some general terms. The first term we're going to talk about is brokerage. This will be defined in detail in license law. Brokerage is the bringing together of parties to a transaction. And in real estate, of course, we talk about brokerage, who can do it, when you need a license, et cetera, et cetera. That, in fact, will be a long, long section in license law. I'm not going to beat it to death here. And then when we talk about a broker, as we refer to it, a real estate broker, is someone who is, in fact, licensed to do these brokerage activities. The definition on this slide actually starts getting into the definition of brokerage activities, but again, I'll come to that at a later point in time. Next word, provisional broker. If you're watching this course, you probably have a decent idea what a provisional broker is. You are in this course to try to get your license as a broker on provisional status. So what that means is you pass a 75-hour course. You still have 90 hours worth of education you'll have to do over the next 18 months. But provisional broker, we will talk to you in license law about what you can do and what you need to practice to make money in North Carolina. Commission, when we talk about commission, little c commission, we're actually talking about your compensation, and we will go into deep detail about how you earn your compensation, when you can collect your compensation, and how it should be paid coming up later. And when we use the word cooperating broker in firm, think about this for just a moment. If you've never looked at it before, oftentimes when a listing agent takes a listing, what they do is they put it in a multiple listing service. And what they're doing is they're offering it to other agents. If you will bring me your client, I will pay you a commission. So in other words, if I have the listing and someone brings me their client, they would be the cooperating firm. So keep your eye out on that. So it just helps you read questions is what it amounts to. All this is just vocabulary. Let's get into something a little more important here. Okay, it's going to be a big deal as we go forward, talking about the creation of agency. What I want to put in your mind right now is throughout this book, watch how often we create something, and then in a couple of slides, I will tell you how to terminate it. These are both important things. As we talk about creation of agency, what you're going to find out is that the Real Estate Commission requires that all agency agreements be in writing at the appropriate time. So let me give you 5 things that the Real Estate Commission requires when it comes to agency agreements. I'd like you to go ahead and write these down. I will try to bring these up in the future as they come up. But here are the 5 rules of agency agreements. Recognize that I'm not talking about this slide. It's just related to this slide. All agency agreements must be in writing, but you're going to want to put in parentheses at the appropriate time. Okay. All agency agreements must have a start date and an end date. All agency agreements must have standard non-discrimination language, and all agency agreements must have your license number. Okay, so as we go through those, has to be in writing, has to have a start date, has to have an end date, and cannot be automatically renewable. Must have standard non-discrimination language, fair housing language, and then it must have your license number. These are the 5 rules of agency agreements. I will bring these up every time that we bump into them. Why are we bumping into them right now? We're talking about creation of agency. What you see here are some of the possibilities that exist with agents working with clients. You would have a listing contract if you're working with a seller. And of course, when you're working with a seller, the agency agreement is actually written in the name of the firm. If you're working with a buyer, we have buyer agency agreements. We have exclusive agreements. We have non-exclusive agreements. We have contracts for this. A dual agency contract is a contract where your client is recognizing that not only are you working with them in a transaction, but it's very possible that you may also be working with the other party as well. For example, if I took a listing and then my buyer became interested in my listing, that would be an example of dual agency. We will talk about that in excruciating detail a little bit later. Property manager just simply means that I'm working for a landlord, trying to do the best with his investment on that particular property. In-house brokerage agreements refer to the fact that when I work with a firm, I'll actually have an agency agreement with my firm. Do you remember earlier we talked about the idea of the fact that with the agent, and I'm an agent of the agent technically. So I have to have an agency relationship with my firm. So we have agreements for that. And then I will mention this to you right now. Implied agency agreements created by the conduct of parties, that is in fact a true statement. But I'm going to make an important statement to you right now, and I will revisit this at a later time. In North Carolina, if agents are practicing agency correctly, it is impossible to have an implied agency agreement. In other words, implied agency happens when a client believes you're their agent based on your actions. Well, my argument is if you've done your job as an agent, you've had the agency discussion and you've allowed the client to pick how they want to be represented. So how in the world could they be confused about whether you're their agent if they're the ones who ultimately selected it? I will show you the process for this a little bit later. But implied agency in North Carolina, it should not happen if you're doing your job correctly. Creation of agency. Why is this slide important? Well, because I just told you that the Real Estate Commission has a rule that says agency agreements must be in writing. And what I've done now is I've shown you some of the agency agreements that exist. As we move forward in talking about agency, and again, let me see if I can keep this fairly brief. Agency agreements outline the scope of your authority. In other words, they tell you how much authority you would have. For example, when we talk about express authority should be relatively simple. Express authority is going to be spelled out in an agency agreement, okay? And I've said that all of them have to be in writing at some point. A little bit later, I'll tell you that there is such a thing as an oral buyer agency agreement, but it has to be reduced to writing at some point as well. So at the end of the day, remember this, please. Express agency agreements could be oral or written, but the terms have been expressed. That's why written is always better, because if they're written, there's not going to be any ambiguity about that. But express, technically, it could mean oral or written. It's just that the terms were expressed. Implied authority is authority that you are typically given in that's common to an area. So, for example, in North Carolina, there is some authority that you're given by implication. And we'll talk about how that goes along with implied agency that we discussed in just a little bit. Sometimes it's bad, sometimes it's not so bad. We'll drill down on that a little bit later. Apparent authority is a complicated thing to understand. Apparent authority means something to this effect. If you're acting like someone's agent, you better be. Because if in fact you have been acting as someone's agent and then something goes poorly, you can't just say, oh, I'm sorry, we never had it in writing, and so therefore I can't be liable. No, remember, it's your job as an agent to explain agency. It's not the public's job to understand all of this. We're the ones that have been trained for it. Let me give you an example of apparent authority, just so you'll know. I don't think it's very level one, but it's hard to understand. So let me give you an example. Let's say that I just got my license and I'm looking for a place to work. So I'm interviewing with this company, and this company, they represent a lot of new home builders. So I actually meet the broker in charge on site one day. And while I'm on site with the broker in charge, he's showing me the houses that they represent and stuff. I'm getting all excited. Somebody drives up in a great big Mercedes and they're looking at the houses clearly. And so the broker in charge goes over to him and says, hey, look, we sell the houses here. We'd be glad to help you with this. And the guy in the Mercedes says, hey, I'm thinking about buying this house. I'm going to be back next week to write an offer on this particular house. And broker in charge says, well, look, I'm going to be on vacation next week, but Chris here has just joined my firm. I haven't joined his firm yet. I mean, we're just talking right now. But he says, Chris has just joined my firm. He gives me a wink or whatever and says, oh, he'll be glad to help you out. Chris, you got a card? So I give him my name and my phone number. A week later, the guy calls me up. Well, here's the problem. I'm new. I don't have a lot of experience. I end up screwing up everything. The broker in charge comes back a few weeks later and says, oh gosh, Chris has royally messed this up. I'm getting ready to get sued. And he comes up with this brilliant idea. He says, well, I never hired Chris to start with, so I'm not responsible for this. Well, according to apparent authority, he is responsible, because that guy in the Mercedes, when he made it look like I worked for him, a member of the public relied on that word. And so he's not going to be able to take it back. If you ever see the word estoppel, estoppel, I believe it is. If you ever see that come up on the exam, the broker in charge would be estopped from going back and say, no, sorry, I want to do over. That didn't actually happen. No, You're the profession, you're the agent. It's your job to make sure the public understands it. In this case, he misled. I had the apparent authority to do what I did according to the public. So therefore, he's not going to be able to take it back. What's my point on this particular slide? Well, my point is, where does your authority come from? You already know my answer. It would be my preference if you have written agreements so that you know that the authority is expressed. That way it's going to be less ambiguous. And then finally, on this particular slide, notice compensation here. The source of compensation does not necessarily determine agency. Here comes the important part. If you're looking at this from outside of the world of real estate, that may sound like a strange statement. Normally, you work for the party who pays you. But think about this. In real estate, most buyer's agents work for the buyer. That's why they're called buyer's agents. So it's the agency agreement that determines who you work for. I have a buyer agency agreement. I work for the buyer. Having said that, most buyer's agents are actually paid by the listing agent. The seller pays the listing agent splits their commission, they give part of it to the buyer's agent. So that's what that line means, and it's extraordinarily important. Source of compensation does not determine agency. What determines agency? Your agency agreements. That's why these written agreements are so important. Compensation, we'll come back and talk about compensation in the next chapter when we're talking about the actual agency agreements themselves. And we'll show you when you have earned your compensation and how the flow of that compensation goes. If you don't mind, I will skip that for right now because I wanted to get to this slide. I told you just a moment ago that we oftentimes in this class tell you how to create something. And then later we come back and tell you how to terminate it. You are clearly going to be tested on this, okay? So let's take if you're taking notes, make sure you make a note of this particular slide or wherever it is that you take your notes. Termination of agency. The reason I inflect on agency is in the next chapter, we're going to talk about termination of contracts. And you're going to see how they're different. You're going to compare and contrast how it's the same and how it's different. Right now, we're talking about how do you terminate an agency agreement. So here we go. Number one, completion of the purpose. So if I took your listing, I sold your listing, agency's over. I did what I was hired to do, and now it's done. As I told you earlier, I can try to earn your business in the future. If you need me as an agent in the future, I have to earn it again. This is over because I did the one well-defined task that I was employed to do. Okay. Another thing that could happen is expiration of terms of the agency. Let me remind you, just a moment ago, I gave you the 5 rules of agency agreements. And remember, one of them was all agency agreements must have an expiration date. Well, let me say this. If I do not get your house sold, we reach that expiration date, and you don't volunteer to renew. In other words, I ask you if you want to renew, you could say yes or no, but you're not obligated to. So we reach the termination date. If you don't renew it, the next day I am no longer your agent, okay? Expiration of terms of agency. Mutual agreement to terminate the agency. Now I want to look at number 3 and 4 together. Mutual agreement to terminate the agency, and number 4 says breach by one or more of the parties. Do you understand in number 3, mutual agreement means something like this? Hey, look, Chris, you listed my house. You didn't get it. You haven't got it sold yet. Our chemistry doesn't seem to work. How about if we go our separate ways? And then I say to the seller, you know what? I was feeling the exact same way. It's just not working out. I don't think we're thinking the same things. Why don't we just go our separate ways? That'll be fine. That's a mutual agreement. Mutual takes at least 2 people, okay? Mutual agreement. But look at number 4, breach by one of the parties. Now, look, this is going to be a test question, okay? When we talk about breach, here's what I always want you to put down. If any type of agreement is terminated by breach, you should write comma, but there could be further liability. So let me give you an example of that. Matter of fact, we'll keep it very, very simple. If I have a 6-month listing agreement and the seller says something to the effect of, hey, look, I don't want your services anymore. Now, keep in mind, as an agent, I have done everything I was supposed to do. I gave them the advertisement. I did everything that I was supposed to do for them. But the seller, for some reason, says, I don't want your services anymore. I'm letting you go. Here's where this question gets really, really tricky. Can the seller fire me? And the answer is yeah. In North Carolina, we're a right to work state. So the seller can fire me anytime he wants to. But the tricky part on the test question is they say something like this: is the seller entitled to fire me, or is there any legal reason for the seller to fire me? Well, the fact of the matter is the seller can fire me, but remember there might be further liability. If he wants to get out of that contract without any liability, we need to go back to number 3, mutual agreement. But if he lets me go for no reason, then he's in breach of contract. Now, let me remind you, I had a 6-month listing agreement. He fired me 2 months in. What's going to happen next month if he sells that house to someone else and I have not agreed to be released from that contract? Even though I'm no longer marketing the property, I still am going to be, I still have a right to claim the commission on that because it's within the 6-month term, which I originally signed. So the seller in this case does not have a unilateral right to get out of this contract. The seller doesn't have a legal right to get out of contract. Am I saying he can't get out of it? No, he can fire me, but he might still owe me some money. If he wants to fire me, he would probably be best to come to me and say, Chris, how much money do you have invested in marketing, open houses, time, et cetera, and just pay me for that. Then I might go to number 3 and let him out if he were to do that. Okay. Please put a bullet point beside that one. And then we'll get to some of these lesser ones. Operation of law could cause a contract to terminate, an agency agreement to terminate. This is not true, but this is not a law class, so it's okay. Bankruptcy essentially has the effect of terminating agreements that you're under. So if the party were to go bankrupt, it would basically release them from their obligation until some later time they have the ability to convey the property without a problem. Number 6 says this: if I took a listing for the property and then the property is destroyed, well, the fact of the matter is that there's nothing there to list any longer. So that would terminate the listing agreement. Also, it can be terminated by eminent domain. If the government comes in and takes the property, it's very possible that I would lose my right to list that property, to be compensated on that property as well by operation of law. All right, number 7, I hate to do it to you, but number 7 is another case where you need to put a star beside it because you're likely to be tested on this. And here's why. Notice what this says. We're talking about termination of agency, and it talks about death or incapacity of either party. That's a trick. Now, let's go through all the permutations here. If I take a listing and the seller dies, that will terminate the agency agreement. Agency agreements are personal services agreements. And so if the person I took the listing from dies, there's no one there left to serve. Even if it were a married couple and only one of them died, it's still not the same person that I entered into the agreement with. So think about it from this standpoint. If you have an agency agreement and the client dies, boom, it terminates the agency agreement. Now, granted, the surviving heir could in fact enter into a new agreement for me, but they would not be obligated to. But here's why I say this is a trick question. If I work for a firm and I list a property and I die, technically that's irrelevant from a question standpoint, because remember, the firm is the one that had the listing, not me. So if I were to die and I'm in a large firm, the firm would still be able to support the listing. Now, all of that would be different if I were a one-person firm. Clearly, if I'm a one-person firm, I list a property and I die, obviously that would terminate the agreement because there's no one left for it to go to. So out of this particular slide right here, number 4, breach by one of the parties, and then also what effect does death or incapacity have on agency agreement? Please be prepared for those. Ask me questions, put them on the Facebook page, whatever you need to do. Make sure you understand those questions. That could be a couple of good cheat points on the exam.